Hey guys, welcome back to the One Room Schoolhouse. We are here at WallBuilders, and this week we're going through some articles on the website. And so we pulled an article we think will be a fun conversation for us. It revolves around Benjamin Franklin's call to prayer at the Constitutional Convention back in 1787. It was actually June 28th, 1787 when we made the call to prayer. And by the way, lots of articles on the website. If you go to wallbuilders.com, you can click on the library, scroll down. There's a little button that says issues and articles. You can click on that, and then you can just kind of scroll through the articles. There's also a search bar. You can type in the search bar and look for specific topics or articles.
Yeah, we have over 1,000 articles on the website. So, if you're doing a paper or anything like that, it's a really good resource to go. All of them are footnoted to original documents, original sources, primary sources. So just a really great free resource for people if you're wanting to do some research about just about anything.
Yeah, we also, as you mentioned, there's footnotes in the back of it, endnotes.
Or at the bottom.
Endnotes for the back of it, right? But we do that because, as we encourage everybody, we want to make sure that people dig and pursue what's true. Don't just take somebody's word for it. Too often today, somebody says something, and we think, oh, that must be what it was, and we don't dig deeper to know, is that really true? For example, talking about Benjamin Franklin, one of the things we hear so often is, well, he was a deist.
Yeah,
he
said so in his autobiography.
Yeah, this is the copy of his autobiography, and in it, you have it marked, you can open it up, and he actually says he's a deist, right?
Yeah.
So
if we hop around here, and he's talking about it as he's growing up.
Or you can walk slowly if you don't want to hop. That's totally acceptable.
Sorry, Easter just happened, right?
I heard it was around. There were eggs and bunnies. I don't know.
Who knows? Anyways, Benjamin Franklin, he's talking about how he's growing up and he's doing a lot of reading, and he's reading the arguments for the deists. And he's specifically reading about a lot of pastors trying to refute these arguments. But he says, in short, I soon became a thorough deist. Boom, there we have it. This is a primary source document.
Yeah,
he said he's a deist.
Franklin wrote it about himself. Mm-hmm. He said, I soon became a deist, period.
Yeah, right.
There's nothing else in the book.
We can close this book, even though we're only halfway through it. We can close it, not read anything else.
He didn't write anything else. He must be a deist.
Well...
was there something else he said, like right below it?
Yes. So as he goes, literally, so that's where he says, I became a thorough deist. If we just hop down right here, he says, I began to suspect that this doctrine, though it might be true, was not very useful. And he continues to talk about how he looked at the morals in his friends who were deists and who believed it and lived their lives according to deism. And he said, this is a worthless philosophy, this is a worthless theology, because it doesn't make people live a good life, a moral life full of virtue.
You live only for your own benefit. You're not serving others. You're not helping others. You do what you want, what you feel. Just right. It's a very selfish life.
And also, the word deist has meant a lot of different things, but even back then, one of the major threads of deism, and the way that it's commonly defined now, is that a deist believes that there is a God somewhere, but he doesn't have any interaction with the world or with the people who believe in him.
Right, so God might exist, but there would be no reason to pray.
There's no reason to pray.
Because he doesn't answer prayers, right? He wound the world up, he set it loose, and so it'd be silly to pray to a God who doesn't answer prayers because he's not involved in our life.
Yeah, and you mentioned winding. It's commonly referred to as kind of like the watchmaker's God, right? He created the watch, he wound it, and then he let it go and hasn't touched it since. And the clock just runs on its own. But even later in his autobiography, Franklin starts to talk about some of his religious education as he's developing, as he's maturing, because when he said that he was a deist, it was when he was pretty young. But later in his life, he goes back, and this is, again, in his autobiography, again, just a few pages later, he talks about his youth and that he had been religiously educated as a Presbyterian, but, he talks about how he stops going to church because he spends his day on Sunday studying, and sometimes he would go to church because he always gave money for the building churches. He gave money to build one of the first synagogues in America. He back in the day, the way that you would tie would be renting a pew. We were actually sitting in pews. George Washington famously rented a pew in the D.C. church. So he would rent a pew.
If you went to church and someone was like, "You're sitting in my seat," you actually might have been sitting in the seat they paid for. So that used to be legit. Today, it's just like you're probably older and that's rude, right? Like just share the church, love people, encourage, love Jesus people, right? It's great. But it used to be you bought a seat.
That's my seat.
And that was true, right? Hey, you're sitting in my seat. I paid for that. They actually did. You got to get out of their seat.
Yeah, it's totally different. It's kind of funny. But he goes on and he talks about what his actual religious beliefs are. And he says, I never doubted, for instance, the existence of a deity, that he made the world and governed it by his providence, that the most acceptable service of God was the doing good to man, that our souls are immortal, and that all crimes will be punished and virtue rewarded either here or hereafter. And in that, and he goes on, and there's a lot of different places where Franklin talks about his faith, but in that he really lies out a lot of kind of the key doctrines that you don't associate with deisms, because he said that I'm not a deist later on in his life.
Well, and even his autobiography, there's places that he says, I want to thank Providence for his help in this and his help in that. Well, now wait a second. If you believe God's not involved, he's not helping you, and you wouldn't be thanking him for that. And this is just, again, kind of the context where today people say things that doesn't really carry on what's actually true, right? Like you keep saying that phrase, I don't think it means what you think it means. They say that a lot about the founding fathers. And when you look at Franklin, even if you go to the Declaration, because Franklin's one of only 6 guys that signed both the Declaration and the Constitution. So largely unique groups, except for 6 guys. He was one of those 6 guys at the at the Declaration. He then was put on a committee of 3 with John Adams, Jefferson, and then Benjamin Franklin. And one of the things they were tasked with was coming up for proposals for the national seal and motto. And Franklin's proposal, you actually can go back, you can read it in his writings, you can find this online, it's a super easy Google, you can look for it. And Franklin suggested that we ought to have an image, right, for the seal. It ought to be an image of Moses on the side of the sea and Pharaoh's army being overwhelmed by the waters. And in the back, there could be this pillar of cloud and of fire. And then the motto around it would read, rebellion to tyrants is obedience to God. Now, when Franklin's suggestion for what the national American motto ought to be recognizes submitting to and obeying God, and that part of our rebelling against tyrants was so we could obey God, and his image is of Moses leading the Israelites out of Egypt, Pharaoh's army being swallowed by the Red Sea, doesn't seem like a really secular guy, right? Not really what a deist today we would think of would do, but that gives a little context, because Franklin was not largely a secular guy, even though early in his life he did acknowledge he was a deist. Early in his life, he was not really sexually constrained, right? Hooked up with some ladies, had a child out of wedlock. We do know that about Franklin's life, but then Franklin's life did change. We could argue largely after his friendship with George Whitefield, Franklin's life took a very different course. What matters is when we go to the Constitutional Convention, because that's what really the article we're talking about today is Franklin's call to prayer at the Constitutional Convention. So the Constitutional Convention, for the first several weeks, there was a lot of frustration. There was a lot of tension between the different states, and there was a lot of things they didn't think they could overcome. And in the midst of this, Franklin actually makes a motion for his proposal to solve the problem. He says, we need to have prayer. We need to bring in a chaplain, and we need to have time just to get God's help in this. And it actually met with some disagreement because really two reasons. One of them, they thought, if we have to call a chaplain in, people are going to look and think, they're having so many problems. They have to get counseling from a pastor. And they thought they wouldn't trust any document we came up with. So it would give a bad appearance, number one. Number two, we usually would have to pay somebody to do that. And it's such a weird thought, right? Today, if you wanted a pastor to come pray, you'd call a pastor and say, hey, will you come pray? Or one of us could just pray. Back then, right? They thought, no, this should be like an official thing, and we should bring in a pastor, and he should be paid. And they said, we don't have any money to pay him, so we maybe shouldn't do that. Now, the reason I pointed out is because Franklin acknowledged that there wasn't a lot of support for prayer because of those two reasons, of that opposition. And today people would say, now, see, so those guys really weren't interested in prayer. We have other articles dealing with many other signers of the Constitution and their life, and
largely a religious bunch of guys.
Oh my gosh, yeah. They helped start Bible studies and Bible colleges and were ordained ministers. I mean, you go down the list, they were very religious guys, but their opposition was because of the appearance and because of the finances. And so in the negotiations, one of the things that came out was that they should take a 3-day cooling off period. And the proposal was when we come back after those 3 days off, we can do a 4th of July ceremony, because this was on June 28th. So for July 4th, not very long away, we'll do a ceremony and we'll invite a chaplain in. And then people will think, hey, it's just because they're doing a big 4th of July celebration. And then we'll just maybe invite chaplains to stay over. We can then hire chaplains. We can work on it from that point. So they took a 3-day recess. George Washington in his journal says that many of them went to church and they heard from the Reverend William Rogers, who led them in spiritual orations and patriotic orations. And so they do all this, they come back. The reason that we bring all this up is because Franklin's call to prayer has largely been recorded, and this is from James Madison.
Yeah, this is Madison's journal during the Constitutional Convention and the debate surrounding it. Really interesting. You can find it online and stuff, but I've got it marked open right here to Franklin's call for prayer. And what's really interesting about this is oftentimes you think, well, if he's just writing it down during the day, some things might have gotten lost, but Franklin actually wrote to Madison with the text that he had prepared for that speech. So this is a, good authority if it's coming from Franklin.
And the reason it's included in here is because when word got out that some of the founding fathers had opposed prayer, and again, not context given that they didn't have the finances to pay for a chaplain, that the appearance, it was just that these founding fathers, they don't like prayer. There were some founding fathers going, whoa, no, there's more context to that, right?
Yeah.
It's not that I hate God and Jesus and prayer. There's context. And so James Madison was making an effort to help present some of that context. So James Madison had some of the most extensive records from the Constitutional Convention. So he's showing the records. Well, he writes to Franklin and says, hey, as I'm telling what really happened, would you send me the copy of the prayer that you prayed? So Franklin sends him a copy, and that's why it appears in here. And it actually, again, it's kind of interesting that part of this was a defense of people who had opposed the motion of Franklin initially, saying that we're not really opposed to prayer. There was context why we said that. But it's interesting because Franklin, who would be argued to be the least religious founding father, was the guy who actually suggested we should pray. And the prayer he wrote is included in Madison's writings.
Yep. And I'll read a part of it. It's obviously longer, but you can go to our website, read it online there. But I'll pick up here, and he says, in this situation of this assembly, groping as it were in the dark to find political truth and scarce able to distinguish it when presented to us, how has it happened, sir, that we have not hitherto once thought of humbly applying to the Father of lights to illuminate our understandings? In the beginning of the contest with Great Britain, when we were sensible of danger, we had daily prayer in this room for the divine protection. Our prayers, sir, were heard, and they were graciously answered. All of us who were engaged in the struggle must have observed frequent instances of a superintending providence in our favor. To that kind providence we owe this happy opportunity of consulting in peace on the means of establishing our future national felicity. And have we now forgotten that powerful friend? Or do we imagine that we no longer need his assistance? I have lived, sir, a long time, and the longer I live, the more convincing proofs I see of this truth, that God governs in the affairs of men. And if a sparrow cannot fall to the ground without his notice, is it probable that an empire can rise without his aid? And he continues on, and I mean, it's such a good speech.
And one of the things, too, that's worth noting is even in the midst of that, there are several Bible verses he references in this call to prayer, which a lot of times today people talk about the founding fathers really weren't religious. The Bible didn't really influence them. The only way you could think that is if you've never read their writings or you don't know the Bible.
Yeah.
Because if you don't know the Bible, you wouldn't recognize several things he said are from the Bible.
Right, groping in the dark.
If a sparrow can't fall to the ground with his notice.
Even the sentence right after I stopped, he explicitly quotes, right, we have been assured, sir, in the sacred writings. And it's interesting that, right, Franklin appeals to the Bible because if he's a deist, he doesn't...
Convincing them for the motion he's making.
Right, he doesn't believe that the writings are sacred, but Franklin does believe that the Old and New Testament were divinely inspired, which is super interesting for a number of reasons. But he says, we've been assured in the sacred writings that, quote, except the Lord build the house, they labor in vain that build it, right? But even beyond that explicit quote, there are tons of Bible verses in that speech.
And this is what's interesting is you see that clearly Franklin, and this is not a surprise, knowing that when you grew up in early America, the Bible was one of the primary texts that most people learned to read from.
Talked about it yesterday.
Yeah, you're really pretty familiar with the Bible, so it's not a surprise that even Franklin, the least religious founding father, or one of the least religious, would know the Bible, would reference it as the sacred writings. And this is where that call to prayer does become interesting, and just, again, some of the surrounding context, because when we think of the founding fathers, there's some founding fathers that it wouldn't surprise you if you heard that they had encouraged religion, right? John Witherspoon was the president of Princeton University. He was a pastor. That shouldn't surprise you. Benjamin Rush, incredibly religious guy, helped start Bible societies. Helped start the Sunday school movement in America. Some guys you're like, okay, he's religious, I get it. Then there's other people like Franklin, you're like, yeah, that dude's a deist, right?
Yeah.
In his own autobiography, he said he's a deist. Well, obviously there's more to the story. And when Franklin's the one saying we should remember God, that's powerful that the least religious is reminding everybody else. Guys, remember, we had daily prayer in this room because they're in Independence Hall. That's where they did the Declaration. They're now doing the Constitution. They're in the same room. He says, guys, we used to pray here every day. Which also tells you a little bit about the context from the American Revolution. They prayed every day, according to Franklin. He said, and our prayers were heard. They were graciously answered. A deist doesn't believe that God answers prayer. So, right, Franklin's acknowledging God answered our prayer. This is just an interesting look at history that so often we hear something repeated long enough, like Franklin was a deist, that we think that must be true. Now, we wouldn't argue Franklin was a Christian, because at the end of his life, Franklin wrote a letter where he questioned, I'm not sure of the divinity of Jesus. And that was 3 months before he died. And there's actually, have we written an article on that yet?
No, but one's coming.
Okay, we'll get an article on there, because the series of letters is between him, the president of Yale University, Ezra Stiles, who was a pastor.
Really do that.
Somebody should write an article about this. We'll work on that.
Somebody should do that.
We'll assign tasks here in a minute. So in the midst of Franklin replying back to this president at Yale University, Ezra Stiles, he says, I'm not sure about the divinity of Jesus. I've never really given it serious consideration.
Nobody's ever asked me that.
Which, it's an article will unfold a lot of this, why that context matters. He said, but I don't know. However, I'm sure I'm going to find out really soon, because he knew he was old. He was on his way downhill. It's possible in those last 3 months after he wrote that letter before he died, it's possible that he did start investigating the divinity of Jesus. It's possible that he came to believe, we don't know that, but that's why he's one founding father that we wouldn't say we know for sure he's a Christian, because he questioned the divinity of Jesus, and we would say, well, that's pretty pertinent to believing, right, to being saved, to being a Christian is believing that Jesus is the Son of God, the Savior of the world, that he is, right, God in flesh. Franklin wasn't there. These two guys are at least religious, right? Franklin was not there. So it's
to the best of our knowledge. And again, like you said, we don't know, because also who can know the heart?
It's fair to ask that question, right?
Yeah.
However, what does matter is Franklin was not an anti-religious guy. He was not opposed to religion. He actually encouraged the Bible. He encouraged Christianity. At the end of the letter, even we're referring to, he told the president, who was a pastor, he says, now, I'm telling you this in confidence. Please don't let people know, because I've tried to live my entire life being friends to everybody in the Christian community, helping them, encouraging them. I wouldn't want them to think less of me because, of this perception of him not sure about the divinity of Jesus. He said, I want to leave this world the same way I've lived in it, friends with all these groups, so please don't say anything. Franklin was not anti-religious. He encouraged many of these groups. He helped donate to some of these different projects that were going on. So the notion of Franklin being a deist is just a lot different once you study the context and go back and start reading some of these sources.
Mm-hmm. He's certainly a unique case in the Founding Fathers, not identifying with any particular denomination, but supporting all of them. I mean, believing in the power of prayer, believing in life, after death, right? Rewards and punishments based on, whether or not you act morally. He believed in the Bible as the sacred writings, but wasn't sure about the divinity of Jesus. And, there's so much more to the story even than what we've been able to get into.
Yeah, so we'll have some articles on the website. This one is Franklin's Call to Prayer at the Constitutional Convention. There's a lot more. Also, we have some articles related to some of this in the Founders Bible as well. If you guys are not familiar with the Founders Bible, you can go to WallBuilders.com and learn more about it. I think it's one of the coolest things we have done, because it links a lot of the quotes from the Founding Fathers by the verses they are referencing. So as you read through the Bible, you will come across a quote from them with a footnote, so you can go back and read their own writings with them referencing how the Bible shaped what they were thinking about an issue, a project, a policy. So really cool stuff. But we're going to be going this week, again, through more articles from the WallBuilders website. So if you guys want to learn more, make sure you follow along, and we'll see you back here tomorrow at the One Room Schoolhouse.